Hello everyone, in this video we're going to talk about midterm exam review part 4. This is the first part of our ecology lectures. Starting with 2.1, the first question is, what is ecology? Ecology is all living things on Earth, as well as the environment, as well as how the living things interact with its environment. How big is an ecosystem? An ecosystem is where all the living things live, and an ecosystem could be small or big, right? Even if you have only a spoon of soil, why would you spoon the soil? Even if you have just a little bit of soil, there's still living things in there. There's bacteria, there could be fungi, there could be seas. So that could be an ecosystem. The entire Earth could also be an ecosystem. So the size of an ecosystem could really be any size. What are biotic factors? Biotic factors are anything living. Anything that fits all the living characteristics is a biotic factor. So bacteria is a biotic factor, it's very small. People are biotic factors, fish, otters. Those are all biotic factors. What are abiotic factors? Abiotic factors are anything not living. We're talking about abiotic factors because every single living thing interacts with both biotic factors around it as well as the abiotic factors. So abiotic factors could be the place that you live, the air that you breathe, the water that you drink, the weather, the temperature, the sun. All of those are abiotic factors. The rock that the mushroom is living on. The next one is, what are the levels of organization in ecology? This is going from the bottom one is organism, right? One single living thing is an organism, and that's the bottom level of the level of organization. It's the smallest unit. The second one up is called a population. Why am I screaming? I don't need to be screaming right now. A population. Okay, so a population is all the individuals of one species living in the same area. So if you have a school of fish, a school of tuna fish specifically, then that will be called a population, right? That's one species, the tuna, of something, the tuna, living in the same area. So a school of tuna. A community will be all the living things in one area, or all the species in one area. So it's not just the school of tuna. You could also have small little zooplanktons, some phytoplankton, some other fish. Not very good at naming fish, but you get the idea. All living things, no matter what kind of species it is, in an area is called a community. The next one up is called an ecosystem. An ecosystem is all the living and non-living, in other words, all the biotic and abiotic factors. And then lastly, we have the biosphere, which is the entire Earth. The next one we're going to talk about is the difference between habitat versus niche. Habitat is a word that we talk about a lot. Habitat is simply where you live, right? So for a school of tuna, the ocean that they're swimming in, that area, the ocean itself, the water, the salt in the water, the pH of the water, that's the habitat. Niche is not only where something lives, but also how it interacts with the environment and how it interacts with all the biotic and abiotic factors around it. So for example, for the tuna, whatever the tuna eats, other little fish, whatever bigger fish that eats the tuna, the fishermen that catch the tuna, besides that, the natural niche will be, how one tuna interact with the other tunas in the area. Those are called niche. What are the different types of interspecific interactions? There are many different kinds. If you just look at the list, we have some plant herbivore. There are other ones. Predator-prey is not on here because it's too easy. Some symbiotic relationship. Some mimicry, some camouflage. Those are all different types of interspecific interactions. So the word interspecific means specific is talking about species. Inter is in between. So how different species interact with each other is what we're talking about. The next one, what is the plant herbivore? Clearly, plant herbivore that eats plants. How do plants defend themselves? We talked about how some plants have spikes. We don't like it. I don't like it. Some plants are poisonous. Some plants are bad tasting. Some plants use other little insects to protect itself. So some plants could have ants living in it. Some plants could bring over some wasp to get rid of the caterpillars. What's a competition? Competition is any time when two species or two organisms are sharing the same niche, meaning that they're living in the same area, but they're also maybe eating the same food, drinking the same water, occupying the same space, right? They're not only interacting with the same environment, they're also, having overlapping niche, not just the environment itself. That's a competition. That the competition arises if there's not enough of something, right? If there's not enough space, not enough food, not enough water, you have competition. One result of a competition, well, here comes the difficult part, right? A lot of students get a little confused over here, so let's talk about this. One result of the competition is called competitive exclusion principle. What does that mean? Competitive is competition. Exclusion means you're excluding each other. What does that mean? It means if two species have the same niche, again, you need to understand what a niche means. If two species share the same niche, then they cannot coexist. Okay? So if two species are sharing the same habitat or food or water or space, and there's not enough food or water or space in the habitat, then they cannot coexist in that same area because there's too much competition. One of them is going to go away. Okay? So one result of competitive exclusion is one is going to live, the other one is going to die. We don't have a picture here. So, right. So if you have two species, right, one could survive, it's better at surviving, it's better at the competition, and the other one's going to die. And then the next one is there's something called a character displacement, which is the other result of competitive exclusion if both species get to live and not one of them die. So here, this picture shows you that we have birds with its beaks. When these birds are on its own islands, their beaks are the same size, meaning that they're eating about the same type of food. When they're all sharing the same island, there's not enough food, and the result is, as a result of evolution and natural selection, of if everybody's, ends up surviving, this is not a choice. They're not choosing how big their beaks get. It's just that the ones that have a bigger size of beak for this one, a smaller size of beak for this one, are better at surviving because they're eliminating the competition factor. So as a result, we have this character displacement, this entire, slight change of character to allow everybody to live so that we're avoiding the competition. Not intentionally, just turned out that way. Okay. Another result of competition is called resource partitioning. So instead of changing character, just think about the name, right? Character displacement, changing character. Competitive exclusion. Nobody can live. Well, not everyone can live if they're sharing the same niche. The other result is called resource partitioning. So this is about the resource that they're sharing. Instead of keep on sharing the same resource, in order to avoid competition, because the ones that are sharing the resources probably didn't have a very high chance of survival because they have too much competition. So as a result, those who don't have overlapping resources get to live. So then as a result, we have this resource partitioning. So they're no longer sharing the same resource. So what you see over here, well, let's just say this is one beach area. We have clams living on the rocks. It looks more like marshmallows. These marshmallows can live at all these depth of water. These marshmallows are doing the same thing. This just sounds so weird. But when they're sharing the same environment, they're sharing the same resource, what ended up happening is that some marshmallows are living on the top part of the rock and the other ones are living on the bottom of the rock. So then everybody gets to live. They live happily ever after. Okay, I hope this makes sense. Next one is called symbiosis. Symbiosis is a close relationship between any type of organism. There are three types of symbiosis. One is called parasitism, one is called mutualism, one is called commensalism. So parasitism is when one is harmed, one is benefiting. The parasite benefit, the host gets harmed. There are two types of parasitism. One is called endoparasite, One is called ectoparasite. Endoparasite is a parasite that lives outside of you. No, I said that backward. Erase that. Endoparasite, endo means inside. Endoparasite is something that lives inside of you, and ecto means outside, and is a parasite that lives outside of you. So endoparasite could be ringworm, lives inside of you. Not great. Ectoparasite, something that's outside of you, it could be a tick. Mutualism is a plus-plus situation where everybody benefits. So for an example, as an example, you could have, what do we say? We say I hate to say this word, Nemo and the clownfish and the sea anemone, and you know what I'm trying to say. Okay, they're both benefiting. The next one is called commensalism, where one benefit, the Nemo one is commensalism, I'm sorry. Mutualism could be the mutualism. I'm blanking. Oh, flowers and pollinators, for example, right? They're both benefiting. Commensalism is when one benefit, one does not get affected. So one example that we saw in class was we have these cows and the birds that follow the cows. So the cows walk through the land and stir up the insects, and the birds go, yay, all the insects are out, let's eat it. So in this case, the cows are not being affected at all, so they're having zero, there's no effect. And then the birds have a plus because they get food. What are the effects on two organisms in the three types of symbiotic relationship? We just talked about that. Aposematic coloration is warning colors of any kind. Any color that looks very alarming to you is most likely alarming to other organisms as well. And the point of that is so organisms know that it's a bad idea to eat them. Mimicry is when two types of species resemble the colorations of each other, the aposematic coloration of each other. So they look alike. There are two types of mimicry. One is called Mullerian mimicry, one is called Batesian mimicry. Mullerian mimicry is when two species look alike and they're both harmful in some way. So for example, this is a wasp and a bee, they're both harmful. They both can sting and they look alike. And this is good because the predators can learn more quickly that eating something that looks like a wasp or a bee is a bad idea. So then they'll stop eating the wasp and the bee and everybody gets to live. Batesian mimicry is when you're setting up a bait. As in, you're pretending, you're being deceptive. You look like you are harmful, but you're really just pretending to be harmful. So for example, this hoverfly looks similar to the wasp and the bee in terms of its coloration, but is really not harmful at all. Moving on to a food chain. So the ultimate source of energy of life is sun, and autotroph is anything that can produce its own food. It could be plants, it could be certain bacteria can be autotroph as well. So anything that can produce its own food they don't ever have to eat is an autotroph. A producer is an autotroph. Photosynthesis, something we already talked about a lot, so we're not going to talk about it again. Basically, let me just talk about it again. You use water and CO2 and sunlight to make sugar and oxygen. Chemosynthesis is another way of being an autotroph. You can do photosynthesis to produce your own food, but if you were to be living on the bottom of the ocean where there's not a lot of sunlight or a lot of food, what do? You use, some organisms can use something called chemosynthesis, where they can use the chemicals being released in the underwater volcano and use that, I'm using a lot of uses, and use that to produce its own food, okay? What is a heterotroph? A heterotroph is anything that have to consume other organisms, so that would also be called a consumer. An omnivore. Omnivore is different from an herbivore, which only eats plants, or an omnivore is when you eat plants or meat. Decomposers versus detritivores. So decomposers and detritivores both take bigger organisms and break it down into its more organic form. Decomposers kind of take smaller parts. So decomposers more like fungi or bacteria, where they take a little bit of food in and then they break it down even more into its smallest molecules that it can be. Detritivores are more like the earthworms, where they take chunks of food and then release some waste, and then decomposers will come in and break down the food even more. You need to be able to identify all of these, so let's take a look at this food chain right here. At the beginning of a food chain, you should always have a producer, because the producers will ultimately harvest the energy from sunlight, turn that into a more organic form of energy, and then use that to support all the other organisms. So we have plant right here as a producer, you can call it primary producer. The next one up is called a primary consumer. And the next one up is usually an herbivore, because it's eating the plant. It could also be an omnivore. And then we have the secondary consumer, which is the second one, not the second one of the food chain, but the second type of organism that's eating something in front of it, eating something below it. And then we have the tertiary consumer, where you can also call it the top consumer. And this top consumer, or tertiary consumer in this case, is a carnivore. You can have a food chain that's a little more complex. For example, this one, what you see is that we have the sun, the ultimate energy for all living things. We have plants, our primary producers, which are also called, this word, autotrophs. And then we have two different types of primary consumers, and then we have some secondary consumers, we have some tertiary consumers. And then after all these organisms, after all these organisms die, they can also be broken down by the fungi, bacteria, which you can call decomposers, or detritivores over here. All right, moving on. What is a food web? A food web is more complex. Instead of only having one chain of who eats who, who's really consuming the energy of who, we have an entire network of who eats who. That's a food web. How do I identify who eats who? You look at the arrow. Pay attention that every time you see an arrow pointing at something, that's always where the energy is passing to, or who's doing the eating. So for example, we have this rabbit. Rabbit always get eaten. They're so sad. This rabbit and the fox, I guess. And the fox, the arrow is pointing at the fox. So the rabbit is being eaten, the fox is eating the rabbit. This is very easy to understand, even if you don't understand the arrows. But if you look at this one over here, you know, you got to think about who's eating who. This cricket is being eaten, and these guys are doing the eating. They're consuming the energy. They're receiving. They're on the receiving end, which is why the arrows are pointing at them. The next one is called what are trophic levels. So if you're turning a food web into an energy pyramid, the bottom of the pyramid versus the top of the pyramid are different, right? So this is the first trophic level, second trophic level, which are eating all the organisms in the first trophic level, third trophic level, fourth trophic level, right? What type of organism make up each trophic level? The bottom one should always be producers. The second one is primary consumer, and it's usually herbivores, as we said before. And then the next one up is secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. Does a certain animal have to occupy one specific trophic level? The answer is no, because, for example, let's see, this fish over here, right? It could be a secondary consumer if you're following this food chain of this food web. But if you're following this one over here, that makes this fish a tertiary consumer, right? So the answer is no. An animal, depending on, well, an animal fits in different parts of a food chain or a food web. Well, different parts of a food web, which gives it different trophic levels. There are three types of ecological pyramids. There's a pyramid of energy, which shows you how much energy is being used. Well, that this entire trophic level holds, right? So this is a pyramid of energy. We have also something called a pyramid of numbers, where instead of having different energy, we have number. All right, I had a picture. So this one is called a pyramid of numbers. So instead of looking at how much energy each trophic level holds, we're seeing how many individuals there are for each pyramid. So this is the only kind of pyramid that doesn't have to be upright. The last one is called pyramid of biomass. So the pyramid of biomass is talking about how much they weigh. So you could calculate it in terms of grams. And usually the pyramid of biomass is also an upright pyramid. The next one is how much energy is lost from one trophic level to the next. 90% of the energy is lost and 10% is saved. So the reason for that is because, so just think about it, right? If you eat 3 pounds of burger a day, you don't actually gain that 3 pounds, really, because a lot of that pounds that you're eating is actually being used in your body as you're just going about your days, staying alive. So as a result, only really 10% of the energy actually becomes, or 10% of the biomass or energy actually becomes the body weight.